I reprinted my up-throw cam, so while I have everything taken apart, I kind of want to show how I have this thing set up. There's a couple of changes that I need to make. I'm not real happy with this coat hanger that I use for this wire here, and I also made it come up a little bit too high. It's working and I'm having fun playing with the machine, so that's going to be on my to-do list for later, and I do need to tighten this on there. To connect my weight basket, I made this little wire, and the straight end hooks into the pulley, and the little hook hooks into the basket, which I have 6 ounces of BBs. I did some testing, and 6 ounces seemed to be just right. And I also used the middle hole. There's 3 holes: the outside hole, the middle hole, and the inside hole. And I used the middle hole for all of my testing so that I could put the right amount of weight in there. And let me see if I can get it hooked in. And if you move your hook or your string to the outside hole, you're going to get a whole lot more pull down. And if you hook it to the farthest to the inside, you're going to get less pull down. So depending on what you're making, what kind of yarn you're using, you may feel like you need more or less pressure. So that's why I did all of my testing on the middle, so that if you needed to go more, you could. And so 6 ounces is perfect for me. Okay, I'm redoing just this part of the video because Steve emailed me and said that I had my cams in upside down. And what's funny is they were working perfectly with the cams upside down. But which shows I'm not an expert. I'm just trying to show the settings that are working for me. And what was crazy is the cams were working when I was knitting, and so I didn't notice anything was off. But the first ones I printed were in black, and I did install those correctly because I followed Steve's video step by step. But these are easier for me to see. That's the only reason I reprinted them. And so whenever I put them back in, I didn't pay any attention. I had them in upside down. You have to really look for this flat edge, and it makes so much more sense for the needles to come down or go under with the flat side up. So I really should have paid attention to that. So I'm sorry if I confused anybody on the first video. So hopefully you'll go back and see the corrected and maybe not made the same mistake that I did. So anyway, he also mentioned that he thought my cylinder wasn't spinning, that everything wasn't spinning, but it's spinning really well. The only thing is that when this cylinder is bolted down to the frame, and I'll show that in a minute, it holds everything down. So when you're using the spacer and the gear ring, put this in the right area, the yarn carrier has to go between these 2 little bump outs. I always get that backwards. Sometimes I get it all bolted down and I have it in wrong. So I like my rubber stopper all lined up there. You can put the rubber stopper anywhere you want. But once the cylinder is bolted down, if you bolt it down too tightly to the frame, sometimes it makes it hard to spin this gear ring around. It was hard for me because the cylinder is pushing everything down. So, and it could have been that I did not sand this enough, but it was hard for me to get in there and sand that. Also, I tried sanding the bottom edge of this, but I was afraid that I would make it a little wonky, so I ended up making a really thin spacer, and I did put the files up on Thingiverse in the remix section, and this is about 0.8 millimeters. And if you go too thick, then you get a little bit of play in your yarn carrier because the cylinder is not holding everything down. There is a little tiny, I mean, this is really thin, it's a tiny space, but it was just enough to put that down on the frame first, and it was just enough to lift the cylinder slightly so that it's not clamping everything down so hard. So you just have to know that if you use that spacer that you're, let me see if I can hold this down. I'm going to get it on the frame in just a minute. When you bolt your cylinder down to the table, you're going to get a little bit of play. Just a tiny bit, but it's not enough to make your stitches, in my case, it's working fine. It doesn't mess up the yarn carrier. Now, I did print up some really thick ones, and it was pulling this up too much, and it was messing up the way the needles were grabbing yarn. So I found the perfect thickness for me, and I do find it easier to crank. Let me go over to the frame and get all of this bolted down. Okay, I have my half marks on my cylinder. This is a 60 slot cylinder. I have the half marks marked in red. I have a little blue fingernail polish here to mark where my ribber stopper is. I really don't know what you call that. I guess you would call this the pin, but your fin on your ribber is going to bump up against that. This fin right here. So I like mine toward the front where I sit. Some people like the pin on the opposite side. So when I glued mine in, I just glued it next to one of these holes where you bolt the cylinder down, so that I could put it in this general area here in the front. That's what I'm used to. That's the way I have my Roboto set up, in that way. So, but since this is round, you can mark your cylinder any way you want, and make any slot to be whatever you want it to. So I've marked your standard toe and heel in yellow. So this area between my fingers is going to be your standard toe and heel. And also I did it on the opposite, because sometimes you want to shape your toe on the opposite side of the carriage so that your pattern repeats, or your stripes, look the same. And I marked a little bit wider toe and heel in orange, so that gives me 2 extra stitches. So you can make it as wide or as narrow as you want, but that's the way I've got my machine marked. Sometimes I do this wider area. So anyway, the first thing I do is I'll put this little spacer down first, and I'll stick a screw up in there to get it started, and then I line up all of my other pieces, which you have to be careful to get your yarn carrier in the right area. A lot of times I'm in a hurry and I don't pay attention, but the yarn carrier has to go between these 2 little stoppers right here, and the yarn carrier will bump back and forth in this area. My other machine is made that way too. My Roboto is the same way, and sometimes I do that one wrong too. So I just kind of line everything up here on this side. I get my ribber stopper over here on this side, and I know that I can start bolting it down. So with the spacer in place, everything is not just, even when I push this down, things are still moving very freely. So I'm going to go ahead and bolt this down, and I'll be right back. Alright, everything's spinning freely. I don't have any needles or yarn or weight or anything on there now, but I know that this works because I've disassembled this machine so many times. So I do have my cams correctly installed now. I do like the lighter colored contrast cams, so because I can really see down in there now and see what's going on with those cams, because even on my Roboto, sometimes a needle will not do what it's supposed to do, and it'll get jammed in there. So it's usually in the area where those little up throw cams are. So just know that I'm not an expert. I'm just trying to show some things that have worked for me, and they may or may not work for you. And I thank Steve for letting me know that I had my cams end upside down, but I probably would have knit with them like that forever because they were working fine. But hopefully I didn't confuse somebody who was trying to put their machine together. But so don't use my video to put your machine together. Just maybe use some of the information to help you set it up. But go to Steve's videos on the assembly of the machine. You can't go wrong if you do that. So once you've got your machine mounted and ready to start knitting, the first thing you're going to need to do is set the yarn carrier. So I've got it about where I think that it's going to catch yarn. I do think I may have it a little bit high, but we'll see how it traps the yarn in just a second. I am using some stem weights from another knitting machine that I have. This is about 3 pounds. So I'm going to go ahead and hang that to my cast on bonnet, which I already have hanging from every other needle, and I'm going to finish hanging these once I get my yarn threaded, and then I'll come right back so that we can watch these needles and compare it to the yarn carrier to see if it's set right. I can already tell that the needles aren't catching right because it's not knitting my yarn off of my cast on bonnet. So I'm going to already adjust the height of the yarn carrier. So I think I probably need to drop it a little bit. And again, I may have to do all this over again once I get my ribber on, because you don't want the ribber needles bumping up against it either. So I've dropped it to the lowest that mine will go, just to see. And I'm gonna just kind of slowly knit. What I'm looking for, hopefully it's showing in the camera. I might wait till it comes back around so you can see what I'm talking about. When the needle that is the next one to go down, the yarn needs to be landing about where the hinge is for the latch, and I'm a little above that, but it is knitting now. I'm going to get a few rows in and correct this mess that's going on over here so I can get a few good rows in. Alright, hopefully you can see. This is very hard to videotape, but this needle is the next one to come down, and I'm trying to do this in the camera and not live. And the yarn is landing about halfway where the hinge of the latch is, so that when the needle comes down, it's gonna close. The latch is gonna close over that yarn. So I'm watching as the latches close, and also up here I'm watching as the yarn goes into these hooks. And also I have the needles really close to the yarn carrier. You don't want them bumping against the yarn carrier, but there's just a little millimeter of space. I don't have anything to measure with, but I can barely get my hook. I'm using my hook as a guide. I can barely get it slide in between. That's how close I have them. So let me knit a few rows and see if that is working properly. So you have to do some tests yourself and see if your cylinder needles are grabbing. And so far this looks good. So the next, alright, the rubber dial has a fin on the bottom that is going to bump up against that ribber stopper, or the pin as most of them call it, down inside there. And I've mentioned that I have mine marked in blue. So when I get ready to set this ribber down inside the machine, first I'm going to orient it correctly. This tappet plate needs to be on the same side as the yarn carrier, and then before I set the whole thing down, I'm going to rotate that rubber dial and make sure the fin is lining up with my blue spot that I painted on there. And then I'll shove it down, and then you'll feel that it stops. And then you'll check and make sure that your rubber dial slots are lined up with a needle slot on the cylinder. And if that is not correct, you're going to have to loosen the screw that is on the top of the rubber dial, and you're going to have to move this you're going to have to adjust this fin to where those line up. And it's usually best to do it before you have any knitting on the machine. I find it easier because you can reach up under and hold the fin while you turn things, you know, but mine is lined up pretty good right now. So I've got the ribber arm down as far as it'll go, and I have a pretty good size gap down in here where the fabric has room to move. I probably have it a little bit bigger than it needs to be, but if you're using thicker yarn, once you start building up fabric that's knitting from the ribber and the cylinder, it may have trouble going down. So first I want to put in a couple of ribber needles. Alright, so I'm going to pick a needle that lines up with the ribber dial. Let's see, let's do this one right here. So I pulled the cylinder needle up to where the stitch drops below the latch. So if I shove this needle back down, that stitch will come off. It'll close the latch and slip right off of the needle. So I'm going to use a ribber needle and hook onto that stitch, and then I'll flip the ribber needle into the slot that corresponds with that needle, and sometimes I'll pull that cylinder needle forward to kind of stretch that stitch out a little bit, make sure it doesn't fall off of the ribber needle. And once you get the ribber needle in there, you can just slide it back. You can flip this needle butt out and pull it down, and when you do, the latch is going to close and that old stitch is going to drop off of the cylinder needle and it's going to stay on the ribber needle. But what I need to do now is get my yarn carrier back around to over here so I can see if that ribber needle is going to bump into the yarn carrier. It's probably really hard to see, but I can tell that this ribber needle is going to bump into my yarn carrier. I really don't want to raise my yarn carrier too much because right now I have it timed perfectly with my cylinder needles. So my next thing would be to loosen the bolts on either side of the ribber arm and raise it or lower it slightly so that that needle is not bumping into my yarn carrier. I don't want to lower it so much that I can't, I don't have a gap for all the new fabric to go down. If you lower the ribber dowel too much, then the fabric is going to be too thick to go down between those two things, the cylinder and the ribber dowel. So I'm going to adjust that slightly. So I use a caliper and I measure on each side of the ribber dowel at each arm on both sides, and I measure the distance between the cylinder and the ribber dowel so that I can make sure they're level. So let me see what it is right now. I just rest my caliper on one of the little flanges of the needle slots, and then I bring my caliper down to where it touches the ribber, but I don't push on it because I don't want to change what it really is. So that's about 9 millimeters. So I'm going to lower it about a millimeter and see if I can get some clearance for my ribber dowel. Okay, I've loosened the arm off of these rods here, and I've got my ribber needle sticking out. So I'm going to kind of move the yarn carrier over the top of that ribber needle, and it's touching and I don't want it to touch. There's not enough of a gap. So I also don't want to lower my ribber arm too much lower, which that gives me about a millimeter of clearance underneath the yarn carrier for the ribber needle not to hit. I'm just kind of looking at it from the side, and I'm going to go ahead and measure and see. And so let me go ahead and level this thing, and then I'll tighten my bolts, and then we'll put a few ribber needles in. Alright, I've measured both sides, and I don't know how I came up with 7 millimeters a while ago, but I measured here close to this arm and close to the other arm. And I came up with 7.6 millimeters. And I measured the arm when it was coming close to this rubber needle so that I'd know, or when the yarn carrier was close to that rubber needle. So let me bring it back around. The cylinder needles are still knitting as they should. I don't think I've dropped any stitches, thank goodness, because I really don't want to start over on this video. Alright, let's watch this rubber needle right here where my finger's at and see if it comes out. And it is touching the yarn carrier, but it's not like bumping into it. It could do okay, but I definitely need to drop this even a little bit more. So let me do that again. Alright, got all these cables in the way here, but I do think that I have it set just right, and I ended up 7.3 millimeters from the top of the rubber dial to the top edge of the cylinder, and that seems to be just about right. Okay, the next adjustment that we're going to make is these two little dials on the top, and what that does is when the rubber needle enters into, and you can't see it on this side of the machine, but the tappet plate, once it enters into the tappet plate determines how soon that needle is going to come out and how far it comes out. So that's where you adjust this. And what we want to happen is that whatever ribber, you may have a 2x2 rib or whatever, but the needles have to knit in order as the yarn carrier comes around. So it'll have to, in my case, I have a cylinder needle, then a rubber needle, then a cylinder needle. So they're going to have to take turns. And you don't want the rubber needle poking out before this cylinder needle that's supposed to knit ahead of it. So you'll watch and make sure that they each take turns, and you'll also make sure that the yarn is landing about where the hinge of that latch is on the rubber needle, so that when the needle pulls back, that the latch will close over the yarn and catch the yarn like it should, or else you'll get some drop stitches. So there are several reasons why you would get dropped rib stitches, and one would be you have a bad latch on a needle, you need to throw that needle away, or your timing is not correct. It could be the height of the yarn carrier, or it could be the tappet plate needs to be adjusted. So what I'm going to do now is, hopefully it'll show on the camera without the tappet plate hiding what is happening. If it does, I'll have to pick a different needle. I'm trying to go real slow. Okay, so this rubber needle is getting ready to go inside the tappet plate. It's starting to come out. So I'm also watching these cylinder needles where you can't see them. They're coming up to grab yarn. They seem to be going in the correct order. The rubber needle is completely out. It's getting ready to grab yarn. And so I'm watching over here. Cylinder needle closing, cylinder needle, and then the rubber needle, and then the cylinder needle. So they seem to be in the correct order, but I don't think that. So I'm going to bring the yarn carrier around again. And I've moved the camera a little bit, so here's our rubber needle. So it's going into the tappet plate, but when it exits the tappet plate is when I want to pay attention. So I've got the cylinder needle grabbing right there. The next cylinder needle is grabbing. The next cylinder needle, and then the rubber needle. And you can see that the yarn is about halfway across that latch. So it seems to be okay. And the latch should be able to close over that yarn. And then now the next needle's taking its turn. So it seems to be okay. If it's not, you're going to have to loosen these two knobs on the top, and then you'll move the tappet plate. Just do slight adjustments, and you'll see what order that the needles are knitting, and you'll see exactly where the yarn is going to land on those rubber needles. So I'm going to slowly add in a few more rubber needles and keep knitting and see how this is going to perform. So I've got 4 needles in, but I'm watching from above to see what order these needles are coming down and grabbing yarn, and it seems to be just right to me. So if you're doing this for the first time, just slowly add needles and then knit. You're going to have to use up a lot of waste yarn, but just keep adding needles and knitting, adding needles. And then once you've got all the rubber needles in place, just knit, I always say about 50 rows without any drop stitches, and you'll know you've probably got it underway. But this seems to be doing very well with just these 4 needles. I haven't dropped any stitches yet, so everything looks good. So as the last 2 adjustments on the machine have to do with the stitch length and whether or not the tappet plate is actually knitting the needles. So I have mine set in the middle, and that determines the length of the stitch. You can see the length of the stitch that I have on here, and I think that's just about right. It just depends on what yarn you're using. If you feel like the stitch is choking up too much on the needle, that means the stitch is too short, so you would move this arrow toward the machine so that it would make the stitches a little bit longer. I find that right in the middle handles just about any sock yarn that I want to put in this machine. And this little screw here where it says in and out, that just means in work or out of work. So if you have this pushed over to slide that over to the out of work position, that means that none of the rubber needles are going to knit. They're not going to be controlled by the tappet plate. They're going to be following a track in there that they're just going to go into the tappet plate and go back out of it without knitting. So just remember, in work or out of work. So that's it for the rubber. Okay, I hope that this helps someone who's setting their machine up for the first time. Just know that it does take a lot of time, and you may have to rethread the machine several times because you'll probably drop stitches in the process. But just walk away from it if you get tired, and then come back and try again, because in the end you'll have everything all set up the way it needs to be, and you'll have learned your machine in the process. And so when you get ready to start your projects, you'll know exactly what's going wrong if a problem comes up. So anyway, give it a shot.